Okay. So as you sit here today, is the risk of any type of future surgery to the elbow in that 20% group, or is it probably less than 20%?
It'd be significantly less than 20%.
Okay.
Relatively rare to reoperate this problem.
As we go. I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit AA. This is a record from October 4, 2009. Can you tell me, are you familiar with a record like that?
I've seen similar things at some of the other SSM hospitals.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there's a diagram of the body on that exhibit. Do you see that?
Yes.
And are you familiar with a diagram, an image like that for a patient or a physician to point out where there may be body problems?
Yeah, I've seen these before.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is the image? There are two images of a human figure, correct?
Yeah.
There's a left and a right. Or there's a front and a back, right?
Okay.
Of
So
image
this is
of the
the back here, but then he's got the arm turned.
Right. But there's only one arm that could be on.
Yeah.
When you're facing in the back, which arm is that?
There'll be a left on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just to be clear, the diagram from October 4, 2009 indicates tenderness in the left elbow for Mr. Crowley, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
And that would have been a complaint that Mr. Crowley had 7 years before the auto accident from 2016, correct?
Correct.
Epicondylitis, you provided some materials to, or you or your office provided some materials to Mr. Crowley, and one of those I'm going to show you has been marked as Exhibit B. What is that document?
That's a standard patient instruction sheet that prints out at the end of the visit after you've seen the patient.
And the patient instruction sheet, that's for tennis elbow and provides exercises?
Yes.
Okay. You've also called tennis elbow lateral epicondylitis?
Yes, sir.
And you mentioned earlier that there are causes of lateral epicondylitis from overuse, essentially repetitive
That's one
injuries.
One potential cause, yeah.
And what sorts of activities can cause lateral epicondylitis from overuse?
Most of the patients I see are usually involved in manufacturing operations or some type of repetitive use.
And when you say manufacturing operations, what do you mean?
Working on a manufacturing line.
Where they're doing the same task repeatedly,
yeah.
over and over and over again? I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit CC, physical and psychosocial risk factors for lateral epicondylitis, a population-based case reference study. Are you familiar with this study?
Not this specific one.
Okay. It's published in Occupational Environmental Medicine Journal in 2003?
Yeah, I don't subscribe to that one.
Okay. You would agree that that's a reputable journal?
Yes.
Would it surprise you if they determined that lateral epicondylitis is related to forceful work and the combined factors of force, posture, and repetition?
For the repetitive cause of it, yeah, that's correct.
You would agree with that?
Yeah.
That the conclusion for this article makes sense to you?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
You would agree that, I mean, you wouldn't disagree with the author's finding with respect to that specific finding, would you?
I would object.
It's certainly one potential cause of it, yes.
And with respect to Mr. Crowley, did you ever take any sort of a history from Mr. Crowley to determine specifically what Mr. Crowley's job entailed in terms of any sort of repetitive or force type work?
I know that Mr. Crowley is an architect.
Did you, what is your understanding based upon that as to Mr. Crowley's specific job demands?
I didn't go into all of it for an architect, but usually architects do more computer type work, CAD type drawings, etc. They're not lifting all the time.
Okay, I'm asking based on your, what I just asked you is, you indicated that based on your experience that you've seen people in the manufacturing process develop lateral epicondylitis from repetitive functions, correct?
Correct.
And those functions didn't require heavy lifting, did they, in your experience?
Some of them do and some of them don't.
Okay. And that's what I'm saying, is that you've seen lateral epicondylitis from workplace repetitive settings where there has not been heavy lifting as part of that repetitive activity.
Some of them have been like 1 or 2 to 3 pounds. Is that what you're meaning? Yeah. They do thousands of units a day, but they'll, some of them have been very light.
Do you testify as an expert ever?
No.
Do you treat workers who have carpal tunnel syndrome?
I've been doing less and less over the last 10 years, and I hardly do any work comp. I'd say for the last 5 years I've done almost none.
Okay.
It's all regular patients.
You have seen over the time frame occupational related carpal tunnel syndrome?
Yes.
Is that also an injury that's caused by repetitive workplace activity?
Can be.
And Mr. Crowley's job, you've come in here today and you're attempting to give an opinion as to the cause of his lateral epicondylitis, aren't you?
I'm giving my opinion based on what I know about the case.
Okay. And what you know about the case is that you haven't taken the time to find out exactly what activities Mr. Crowley performs with respect to his daily workplace, correct?
I would object, that's fine.
I didn't get into his daily workplace, no. I have rough ideas of what an architect does.
Did you ask Mr. Do you know his job also entailed field visits where he would climb up and down ladders?
No.
Do you know that his job duties would also entail laser sight work at sites whenever he was on these field visits?
No.
Do you know what laser sight work entails?
Just briefly from my engineering days.
Do you know how many times he has to climb up and down ladders as part of his job?
No.
the injury that he had previously in 2009 was related to falling off the ladder. You're aware of that?
Just from what you showed me today.
Yeah. The work that he does, you would agree that it's likely that he does a lot of work on a computer?
Yes.
When you saw Mr. Crowley in November of 2017, you indicated that the patient has had long-standing chronic left lateral epicondylitis. What do you mean by long-standing?
Well, the whole time I've known him, he's been having some pain.
Okay. Is
At
that
that
years?
No, I've only known him from December 19th, 2016, when I first met him.
In his, I'm going to show you. What's been marked as Exhibit DD, which is a portion of his physical therapy records. Can you read that highlighted portion?
Also suggested dropped keyboard to reduce stress on left elbow.
Okay. What can you, before we go through that, what is the date of that physical therapy record?
October 5th, 2016.
And in your role as a physician, do you review physical therapy records related to a patient?
Well, this was before I met him. So I'm not reviewing something somebody else did.
In your role as a physician, you don't ever review physical therapy records?
I review them when I've ordered the physical therapy, and yeah, I'm taking care of the patient at that point. This was before I saw him.
But you're familiar with physical therapy records, particularly SSM physical therapy records, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And do you know Lisa Garger?
No.
Here, let me just take a quick look at that. When you, before I ask you that, what was the records that you, I may want to look at one of the records you handed to him. Exhibit 11. So, I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
Brent
Sumner. Mr. Sumner handed to you Plaintiff's Exhibit 11 earlier, and he asked you some questions about it, which is Mr. Crowley's physical therapy records. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Okay. Did you tell him that that was before you had seen Mr. Crowley and you refused to answer any questions about him?
Well, I didn't refuse to answer either of the questions from either of you.
Okay. Did you bring up the fact that It was before you signed?
No, he just asked me to take a look at something that was in the records, similar to these other records that were before I've seen it. This is the first time I've seen these physical records, physical therapy records.
If you look at Exhibit 11, look to the October 5, 2016 record.
Okay.
Why would a physical therapist suggest dropping Mr. Crowley's keyboard to reduce stress on his left elbow?
That's, she's suggesting an ergonomic keyboard instead of the regular one.
Suggesting a dropped keyboard, which is an ergonomic keyboard?
Yes.
Okay. And why would a physical therapist be doing that?
Well, they're trying to make a suggestion to help him.
And what would help him about it?
He could bring his wrist down a little bit and not have to hold it up as far using the lateral epicondylar muscles.
And so it would
Take a little stress off the muscles from the lateral side of the elbow.
and those are the same muscles that you're talking about, which ultimately cause lateral epicondylitis.
Yes, it's the same muscle.
And so Mr. Crowley's prior keyboard was causing stress on that muscle, correct?
I would object. That assumes facts, not into evidence.
This is the one that.
I don't know what keyboard he was using before or after this suggestion, to be honest with you. I haven't seen it.
Okay.
So I can't really answer that question for you.
Well, the assumption would be that if the physical therapist was recommending a change of keyboards, that the prior keyboard wasn't doing his elbow any good, right?
Again, objection calls for speculation.
That would be her opinion.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you disagree with that?
I wasn't there. I can't make a call one way or the other. I don't think it's a unreasonable suggestion to try it, but I'm not sure I'm going to blame the other keyboard for all the problems.
Didn't cause him any problems at all?
Have no idea.
Okay. Well, you're here today that you're giving opinion testimony as to what caused his injuries, right?
Yes.
Okay. But you didn't consider anything about what keyboard he was using beforehand or the later keyboard that his physical therapist recommended that he use, correct?
No, I believed his testimony. When he told me what had happened, I believed him.
Okay.
I didn't start disbelieving him and trying to go into his keyboard issues.
So you're saying that if the patient told you that he was involved in an auto accident, that you didn't need to investigate any other potential causes because the patient telling you that it was the cause was all that you needed?
Patient told me he'd been okay before that, and then he had pain after the auto accident. I'm not an inspector. I'm going to just take a history, and I have to rely on it.
So when Mr. Crowley started physical therapy, did he have any complaints about his elbow at all?
I didn't see it in the record there, no.
Okay. So he didn't have any complaints from an elbow, right?
I would object there, your record.
He told me he had pain after the motor vehicle accident, and I believed him.
Okay. Take a look at Exhibit 11. Do you see in the first few pages of records any reference to any physical therapy related to the elbow?
Yeah, I just see the diagnoses on the back and the neck on the initial physical therapy notes, yes.
What's that?
I just see the low back, concussion, and cervical notes on the physical. That's what the physical therapist entered into her.
Right. Low back,
notes.
concussion,
Neck pain.
neck pain. Nothing about the elbow.
That's what they put in their diagnosis, yes.
Okay. And is he receiving any physical therapy for his elbow in that first visit?
Not in the first visit, no.
So, when you're sitting here today rendering an opinion as to causation, you were not and haven't taken into consideration any potential activity that Mr. Crowley had in his workplace that could have caused lateral epicondylitis, have you?
No, I didn't go through his workplace on that, no. About that.
Has Mr. Crowley, I didn't have the opportunity to go through, you were kind enough to hand me your records on Mr. Crowley in a very organized format. When is the last time that you saw Mr. Crowley?
Looks like it was April 5th, 2018.
April 5th? Is that correct?
Yeah,
So a year ago?
yeah.
At the time that you last saw Mr. Crowley, you discharged him?
Yes.
And has he been back with any complaints since then?
I don't have anything in my records, no.
If you look at Exhibit 11 again, and go to August 22, 2016. In the subjective examination,
Okay.
says, I've got a 3-hole punch in mine, so I don't know what the first, it's something comments. 8/22 was sore after PT the next day again, but then felt better. Do you see that reference?
Yes.
And then it says, rode on ATV yesterday and had much increased pain, 5 out of 10 with ibuprofen.
Yes.
And again, this relates to the spine. Is that correct?
I think so. It doesn't say directly in that sentence. It later refers to low back in the next sentence.
Okay, if you look at the top, subjective examination at the heading is
okay,
what?
gotcha. Yeah, spine. I see it there.
So this all relates to the spine, correct?
Yes.
Take a look for that August 22 exam and see if there's anything noted about an elbow or epicondylitis at all. I would represent to you there's nothing.
Yeah, I don't see it.
Okay. If an individual rode on an ATV frequently, would that be the sort of force or repetitive action that could cause lateral epicondylitis?
I guess if they rode on it frequently enough, yes.
And did you ever ask Mr. Crowley about his recreational activities to determine whether or not there were any outside activities that could be the cause of his lateral epicondylitis?
No, I didn't go into that.
If you look at the well, in your testing, after you do a surgery of an individual like Mr. Crowley, do you attempt to determine how that patient is responding to the surgery in terms of range of motion?
Yes.
And did you test Mr. Crowley?
In several times, yes.
Okay. Can you tell me briefly what your test revealed?
He was initially unable to really extend his elbow after surgery. It gradually got better, and by my last visit, I thought he pretty much had it all back. I thought he had full extension.
And so, in your opinion, based upon your expertise as an orthopedic surgeon, Mr. Crowley's surgery was successful in regaining full range of motion?
At least as of my last visit, yes.
With respect to the other issue that you mentioned, which is strength after a surgery, that would be up to Mr. Crowley to attempt to do some sort of physical therapy or additional work to ensure that he regains strength in that arm?
Well, as much as he can. I don't think it's going to be 100%. And that's based on the repair.
Did you prescribe any physical therapy for Mr. Crowley after your surgery?
I think I mainly did a home exercise program with him. Yeah.
Okay. Do you know how well Mr. Crowley complied with that home exercise program?
Well, I know that he must have done some because he gradually got his extension back from -40 to almost full, so he had to have done something.
But Mr. Crowley, there's references in his medical records to him being morbidly obese based upon a BMI standard. Mm-hmm. Is weight a risk factor for lateral epicondylitis?
Not specifically, no.
Okay. Is it a risk factor for recovery from surgery for lateral epicondylitis?
Again, not specifically. Recovery really depends on the patient's motivation.
It can be an impediment to recovery, can it?
Yes.
Morbid. So you would agree with me that morbid obesity can be an impediment to recovery from surgery?
It could be.
Okay. Doctor, you would agree with me that at the time that you testified earlier in this deposition that the automobile accident which Mr. Crowley was in was likely a significant cause of his injuries, meaning the lateral epicondylitis, that you did not take into consideration that he had reported left elbow tenderness in October of 2009. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And doctor, you would agree with me that at the time you testified that the auto accident was likely a significant cause of Mr. Crowley's lateral epicondylitis, you had not taken any sort of detailed assessment of his occupational activities or demands from his job. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And doctor, you would agree with me that at the time you testified earlier in this deposition that the auto accident that Mr. Crowley was engaged in was likely a significant cause of Mr. Crowley's lateral epicondylitis, that you had not taken into consideration his recreational activities such as riding on an ATV. Is that correct?
Yeah, I had not asked him about that.
You're giving causation opinions without having investigated Mr. Crowley's work and what activities he's required to do at work, as it might impact the cause of his lateral epicondylitis, correct?
I'm assuming that his work could be a partial contributor to the lateral epicondylitis, but I don't know the percent.
And you believe that to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yeah.
And you believe it despite the fact that you can't tell me exactly what his workplace activities are?
You know, I'm a medical doctor and I'm taking care of a medical issue. I'm not a work investigator, and I think you're really coming after me on something that's just way out of my field.
Right, and you're not an accident investigator either, are you?
No.
I don't have anything further.